Government is the problem.
In 1987, Reagan made Greenspan the most powerful banker in the world, the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
The world's most powerful man is on the defensive. Smear and innuendo have laid siege to the Clinton White House.
With recent news reports about the First Lady's cattle futures earnings and with all the Whitewater allegations, many of us Americans are having a hard time with your credibility. How can you earn back our...
Bill Clinton's accusers may lack credibility, but not effectiveness. Thanks for joining me. The president is in trouble. Accusations of serial womanising and shonky financial dealings are steadily eroding his public standing. The mud is beginning to stick. The President and the First Lady have already had to endure private grillings from a special investigator over the Whitewater affair. Soon they face open congressional hearings probing wider financial dealings in the Clintons' home state of Arkansas. Dealings which for Australians bear an uncanny resemblance to the WA ink scandal. The ABC's Washington correspondent Tony Jones went back to Arkansas to meet some of the extraordinary entrepreneurs now coming back to haunt the president. Tony Jones' report also sheds light on some of the shady characters behind the accusations, which now even run to drug smuggling and gun running by former Clinton mates.
Needing money for campaigning, he was losing it in Whitewater. Even more damaging is the Republican allegation that McDougal funneled money from his bank into the Whitewater Corporation and then into Clinton campaign funds. In 1978, Hillary took the family finances in hand. Through the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, she began gambling in risky cattle futures trades. In just 10 months, she made $100,000, having put up only $1,000. His radical team seemed a threat to almost every industry in Arkansas. Now, the relationship Clinton had to his state's business elite is under intense scrutiny.
What we see in Arkansas is really backdoor connections, conflicts of interest, friends helping friends, and really a small group of cronies running the state for their own personal, political, and financial gain.
In 1985, Bill Clinton decided to bring Wall Street to Main Street. He created a new agency that sold tax-free bonds guaranteed by the state to finance industry. Much of America was built on bonds, but Clinton's idea was to give the state more control.
Many of his campaign contributors were receiving huge loans from ADFA. And I think that the governor personally was involved in approving those loans.
It's a story that goes back to Bill Clinton's attempt to fund industry through the state's bonding business. In the free-flowing financial climate, Little Rock bond traders flourished. One of the most successful was a flamboyant millionaire named Dan Lassiter. Lassiter's past relationship with Clinton could now be extremely damaging for the president. For Lassiter was a big campaign fundraiser until he was jailed on cocaine charges in 1986.
Dan Lassiter said that he had a corporate plane on which Bill and Hillary flew on occasions, and he said he regularly served cocaine on those flights, regularly held parties and served cocaine. And he said it was just a part of doing business. And among those people who he did business with the most were the President and the First Lady.
He loved singing the hymns and the gospel music. And
Lassiter's friendship with Roger Clinton became a political liability. The younger Clinton worked for Dan Lassiter until he too was arrested on cocaine charges.
My brother has apparently become involved with drugs.
This is a person that no governor in his right mind would be seen in public with or would open their door to.
Now, Republicans on the crucial banking committee are trying to find out just how much money Lassiter funneled into Clinton campaigns and whether some of that was drug money.
Even while he was under investigation, Bill Clinton urged that his friend Dan Lassiter be given a $30 million bond issue.
We know that Republican investigators are talking to this man, for Dennis Patrick is carrying documents that might eventually help uncover one of Arkansas's dirtiest secrets.
You've actually got your trade documents with you? Yes, I have the originals, as a matter of fact.
Patrick is in hiding, so we brought him to meet us in Washington. He has evidence that Lassiter's company may have been laundering huge amounts of drug money. His knowledge has left him in fear for his life.
It's very frightening to know what may have happened to you. I mean, there's certainly a reason to kill a man for $100 million, or knowledge of $100 million.
His story really begins in Florida sometime in 1985. An old friend, Steve Love, then working for Lassiter, took him on an all-expenses-paid fishing trip on a private yacht and made him a proposition.
He wined me. He essentially dated me. He convinced me. The way he explained to me is he knew how to trade the stocks and bonds in an account that would make me money.
Did you have spare money to invest?
No, I didn't have spare money. He knew I didn't have spare money.
Within days, Love called to summon Patrick to Little Rock. He said he'd opened an account and made $20,000 for his friend, though Patrick hadn't put up a cent.
I would have taken rollerblades to Little Rock for $20-something thousand. You understand?
So how did you meet Dan Lassiter?
I think he was waiting for me. It appeared that he knew I was coming.
He knew about your account?
Yes. He was very knowledgeable of the account. He was very familiar with it.
At the time, Dennis Patrick was a lowly county clerk in Kentucky with assets worth less than $60,000. Years later, a Lassiter insider gave him the documents which show the trades the company made without his knowledge.
My wife has asked me time and time again, why am I keeping these things? I don't even know what they are. And I've explained to her, I don't know why I'm keeping them, but for some reason I did.
They show that trades worth tens of millions of dollars were being made in his name.
There's $11,700,000, and then there are $1 million, $5 million, $4 million, $2 million.
So here's another one here for $5 million. I mean, you were worth a lot of money in those days.
Well, on paper, obviously someone was worth a lot of money. It obviously wasn't me.
This man says he knows at least one major source of black money flowing into Lassiter and Company bond trades. In the mid-1980s, Terry Reid was a close associate of one of America's most prolific drug traffickers, Barry Seal. He says Seal and Lassiter were in business when he first met them.
Lassiter introduced himself as Barry Seal's investment banker at the time.
Who else was there?
Roger Clinton was in the company of the two, of course. At that time, Roger worked for Dan, in fact, was his chauffeur.
Roger Clinton, the president's brother?
Yes, Roger Clinton, the president's brother, was Dan Lassiter's chauffeur.
Reid says that Seal regularly passed on large sums of cash to Lassiter.
From what I observed, and from what Seal said, because he would typically arrive in town with a briefcase that he professed to either contain cash, or on a couple of occasions I actually did observe, did have cash in them. And he would be very security conscious in taking his briefcase down to Lassiter's to have it put on deposit. It seemed to be a very close-knit, secretive operation, and I always presumed it was a bond buying.
And he brought a fleet of planes with him, and he was hauling cocaine into this country by the ton, and that's according to his own sworn testimony.
Money flows. Money laundering, a common occurrence, really to the point of being blatant, out in the open.
An investigator for the Federal Internal Revenue Service, Bill Duncan, tried to follow the money trail.
People on the street talking about it, people in the banks talking about it. A bank vice president walking down the teller line handing out stacks, $10,000 to get cashier's checks for the Seal associates.
Drugs have a way of corrupting local officials, have a way of corrupting governments. There's certainly some corrupting influence in the state of Arkansas. We don't know the extent of that corruption. It needs to be discovered.
Vince Foster was another old friend from Arkansas. He worked for the Clintons as a senior White House lawyer until he was found shot to death in July last year. Because of her presence in his office on the night of his death, Patsy Thomason is under subpoena from the Fisk inquiry, and until he reports, she's saying nothing.
Mr. Estook, I think the direction of this question is toward the Vince Foster episode, and I would decline, Mr. Chairman, to answer any questions with regard to that.
But she's a clear target for Republican cross-examination as they attempt to build a bridge between the president and Dan Lasseter's illegal doings.
And by the time Bill Clinton took the White House, the anti-government rhetoric had become so fashionable that even some Democrats embraced it.
Ronald Reagan had won. Government was seen as the problem, and even though Bill Clinton was someone who believed in government and wanted to use it, he was kind of forced into that Reagan-esque ideology because that was what people wanted to hear.
From the beginning, Clinton aimed to reassure powerful forces on Wall Street. And he did so with a key appointment.
I asked Robert Rubin to serve as assistant to the president for economic policy.
Rubin is the best-known financier in the country at that point because he had run the legendary Goldman Sachs.
Bob Rubin was Bill Clinton's emissary to Wall Street. Clinton placed great trust in Bob Rubin and Bob Rubin's view of financial markets and financial regulation.
He had an enormous amount of credibility because he was a business success, and Democratic administrations always seem to worship people who can excel at business.
At the White House and as Treasury Secretary, Rubin found an unlikely ally. Clinton had asked Alan Greenspan to stay on.
Bob Rubin and Alan Greenspan were very much in lockstep. They had very similar views on Wall Street. It boiled down to the less regulation, the better.
And Rubin populated the Clinton administration with a network of free market true believers.
It wasn't just Rubin and Greenspan who were these free market acolytes. That thinking pervaded the Treasury and the White House.
Among Rubin's acolytes, 35-year-old Timothy Geithner, and Rubin's top deputy, the outspoken Harvard economist Larry Summers.
Summers is tough. Summers is very blunt-spoken, doesn't suffer fools lightly or anyone else, as the saying goes.
Bob Rubin is not a guy who likes confrontation. He's confrontation averse. But he understands that you need someone in there who can swing a heavy axe. And that person was Larry Summers. He was the enforcer.
Together, Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers formed their own pro-business, anti-regulation support group.
They're the committee to save the world, according to the Time magazine cover. These are the people we turn to at that moment, who together, all three in a way, say, trust us.
They seem to have things under control. You know, the world trusted Rubin and Greenspan, so why wouldn't Clinton? You know, and the market was doing great, and the country seemed to be doing great.
Tonight on Frontline, long before the economic meltdown, the story of one woman who tried to warn about the threat to the financial system.
She saw something that people either had not seen or refused to see, and she tried to sound the warning.
What are you trying to protect?
We're trying to protect the money of the American public.
Before the toxic assets poisoned the economy, she warned of their danger.
And that made her the enemy of a very, very large number of people.
She would fight an epic battle with one of the most powerful men in Washington.
It got pretty nasty pretty quickly.
Greenspan turns to her, she turns to him. His face is red, and he's clearly quite upset.
A story from inside the highest levels of the Clinton administration.
They were all part of a very concerted effort to shut her up and to shut her down. And they did, in fact, shut her up and shut her down.
Tonight on Frontline, Alan Greenspan, Brooksley Born, and The Warning.
A Florida woman had her own fight with a bank, and this week we learned that Lynn Simoniak will be paid $18 million for uncovering a massive foreclosure fraud. On Monday, 4 top banks agreed to pay $95 million to settle charges that they used fraudulent paperwork in thousands of foreclosures. Simoniak discovered the scheme while fighting her own foreclosure. Simoniak is a lawyer with special training in spotting forgeries. She got a hold of the bank's newfound mortgage documents and saw that they were signed by a bank vice president named Linda Green. Next, Simoniak went online and looked at hundreds of Florida mortgage records.
Then I began to find the strange signatures.
She found Linda Green had many signatures, and Green was a vice president at a lot of banks, all at the same time. Green had signed thousands of documents.
All within the same week. I mean, this is a very, very active person. In my mind, this is an absolute intentional fraud.
Simoniak filed a whistleblower lawsuit on behalf of the federal government under the False Claims Act. Her $18 million is a percentage of the money that the government recovered.
Just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to lenders trying to speed or fraudulently foreclose in this country. But why would the banks be so anxious to behave this way? And why would politicians in the Treasury Department allow them to do it? Take a look.
We now have either a bunch of these structures that were put together with defective instruments, or the instruments were never conveyed in the first place, and because the dates have passed where you can add things into these structures, there is no fix for this without violating the tax preference. I don't know how you solve this problem. The only thing I can come up with is force this bad paper back onto the originators, repay the MBS holders who bought these things thinking they were good securities and actually bought an empty box.
I'm going to interrupt you a little bit just because we're dealing with, I want to make sure that anybody who's watching this can understand what it is that you're saying. The point is that the people who bought a lot of these toxic securities was your pension fund, the teacher's pension fund, the judge's pension fund, the police and firefighters' pension fund. And those pension funds were sold these mortgages on the belief and verification, both from the ratings agencies, from the banks, and implicitly from the government, that those loans were good. And when we find out that the loans were not good through these foreclosure processes that they're trying to avoid, you either have to pay back the pension that you've raped, or you have to ignore it and continue to drive the system the way that it's being driven. But that doesn't seem to be politically viable much longer. If you look at this, Jennifer, how much longer can we avoid dealing with the core issue of banks making money by selling non-conforming loans to the government by the trillion, and then going forward, betting on their collapse, and then donating the profits to politicians who say it's okay? If you were to look at the core issue here, which is that the savings of America was the piggy bank that this type of product was being sold to, that the savings of America, whether it's the New York State pension managers or any, I go down, we don't have to list all the various pensions, are the ones that got stuck with a lot of this paper, not to mention Fannie, Freddie, and now the Federal Reserve. If you were to look at that core issue, and then you were to look at the understandable anger, not just from the Tea Party, which I know is a constituency that you were catalytic to at its beginning, but across the entire political spectrum, why do you think we haven't seen the organized focus from the Tea Party on this issue in a way that is effective, and for that matter, an organized focus from anybody else who's pissed off, whether they're a Tea Party or not, on this issue? Why do you think it doesn't get addressed politically?